Sacagawea was born around 1789 or 1790 in the region now known as Idaho. She belonged to the Shoshone Nation, a people who lived along the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. Their camps were often set beside the Snake River, which led neighbouring tribes and early explorers to call them the Snake Indians. As a child, she was given several names, a common practice among the Shoshone. In time, she became known as Sacagawea. In her native language, Sakaga meant bird, and Wea meant woman. Her name, Bird Woman, may have reflected her small frame and her quick, graceful movements. She grew up in a close family with her older brother Kamia Wait, another brother, and a sister. They lived in portable homes called tipis, made from wooden poles and animal hides. The Shoshone were peaceful wanderers who followed the rhythm of the seasons in search of food. From spring through late summer, they camped near mountain streams, where they caught salmon and trout. When autumn came, they travelled east to the plains of present-day Montana, where the men hunted buffalo on horseback with bows and arrows. The cold mountain climate required warm clothing. Sacagawea wore a dress and leggings made of soft deerskin. Over them she wrapped a knee-length robe of buffalo hide that also served as her blanket at night. Her moccasins were lined with thick woolly hair to protect her feet from the snow. Many of her garments were decorated with beads and porcupine quills, symbols of craftsmanship and tradition. There were no schools among the Shoshone. Children learned by watching and helping. Sacagawea worked beside the women of her tribe, gathering firewood, making clothing and moccasins, and helping to build teepees. She collected berries and roots, and learned to prepare medicines from native plants. The elders taught her the stories and beliefs of her people, including how the Creator made the world and how coyotes shaped humankind. Around the fire she listened to tales of the little people, spirits said to shoot invisible arrows. For play, she ran races and juggled mud balls with her friends. Like most Shoshone girls, Sacagawea was promised in marriage to an older man and would become his wife around the age of 13 or 14. But in the year 1800, her life changed forever. When she was about 10 or 11 years old, her tribe camped near what is now Three Forks, Montana. One morning, the camp came under attack by the Minnetaree, an enemy tribe armed with guns. The Shoshone had only bows and arrows. 15 of her people were killed, and many others fled. As Sacagawea tried to cross a river to escape, a Minnetaree warrior caught her, lifted her onto his horse, and rode away. Her closest friend was captured as well. The captives were taken more than 600 miles east to a Minnetaree village in present-day North Dakota. Her friend later escaped, but Sacagawea remained behind. She was given to a Minnetaree family and lived among strangers, far from her homeland, not knowing whether her family had survived. Years passed. A Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau often visited the village. He was much older than Sacagawea, but wanted her for his wife. The Minnetaree agreed to trade her to him, and she became one of his Indian wives, once again taken from one world into another. Around the age of 15, Sacagawea and her husband Charbonneau made their home in a village shared by the Mandan and Minnetaree tribes. Life moved quietly until a group of explorers arrived on a mission to chart lands few outsiders had ever seen. Their presence marked the beginning of a journey that would reshape Bird Woman's destiny. At that time, the United States was still a young nation confined between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River, with only faint knowledge of the vast territories beyond. That changed in 1803. In a single transaction known as the Louisiana Purchase, France sold the United States more than 800,000 square miles of territory. The acquisition doubled the size of the country. This vast and largely unmapped region would one day form 15 new states, yet much of the land remained a mystery. What lay beyond the Mississippi? Who lived there? What rivers, mountains, and wildlife shaped its wilderness? President Thomas Jefferson sought answers. He envisioned an expedition that would explore the new territory and continue west to the Pacific Ocean. The journey would follow river routes, record discoveries, and establish trade with the native nations along the way. Beyond exploration, there was strategy. Great Britain was also looking westward, and Jefferson wanted American explorers to reach the Pacific first in order to strengthen the nation's claim. Few stopped to consider that this land was already home to indigenous peoples whose ancestors had lived there for countless generations. To lead the mission, Jefferson chose 2 army officers. The first was Meriwether Lewis, 29 years old, the president's trusted secretary and close friend. Lewis selected William Clark to serve as co-captain. Clark, 33, was known for his calm leadership, his practical skills, and his distinctive red hair. Clark's first challenge was to recruit a team, a corps of strong and capable men who could endure hardship. They needed hunters, carpenters, and horsemen, men who could navigate rivers and survive in the wilderness. Jefferson also wanted the expedition documented, so Lewis and Clark looked for men who could write detailed journals. From those journals, history would later remember one extraordinary young woman, Sacagawea. Clark eventually assembled 43 men who called themselves the Corps of Discovery. Among them were several who spoke French, one who knew native sign language, and another who played the fiddle to lift spirits around the campfire. Clark's enslaved servant York also joined the expedition, sharing every hardship and achievement. One more companion travelled with them, a large Newfoundland dog named Seaman, Captain Lewis's loyal partner, weighing more than 100 pounds. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery departed from St. Louis, Missouri. They rowed against the strong current of the Missouri River in one large barge and 2 smaller boats. Their journey across a continent had begun. By late October, during the season the native peoples called the Moon of the Falling Leaves, the explorers reached central North Dakota. There, in a Mandan village along the river, lived a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Shoshone wife Sacagawea. The captains decided to build their winter camp nearby, a small fort of log cabins they named Fort Mandan. Before long, Charbonneau learned that Lewis and Clark were searching for someone who could help guide them through the mountains. To reach the Pacific, the expedition would need horses, and those horses could only come from the Shoshone. For that, they needed a translator. Charbonneau introduced his wife to the captains. She could speak Shoshone, he explained, because she was Shoshone. Charbonneau himself spoke French and some Minnetaree, which could also be useful. The captains agreed to hire both of them. Charbonneau would receive $500, a significant sum for the time. Together they would join the Corps of Discovery. Through the long, cold winter, Sacagawea and Charbonneau lived at Fort Mandan alongside Lewis, Clark, and York. On February 11, 1805, Sacagawea went into labour. To help with the difficult birth, an unusual remedy was used. Powder from a rattlesnake's tail was mixed with water and given to her. Within minutes, she delivered a healthy baby boy. Charbonneau named the child Jean-Baptiste, though Captain Clark affectionately called him Pomp. He also gave Sacagawea the nickname Janie. When the expedition first began, the captain saw the young Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, merely as a translator who could help them speak with the tribes along their route. They had yet to understand how vital she would become, not just as a guide, but as a key to their very survival on the journey ahead. As winter settled over the northern plains in 1804 and 1805, the explorers faced unrelenting cold. On January 9th, the morning air froze at 21 degrees below zero, and by the following dawn it had plunged to 40 below. The Mandan people called this bitter season Frost in the Teepee, a name that perfectly captured the icy hardship through which Sacagawea and the Corps of Discovery persevered. At Fort Mandan, survival became a daily struggle. The men of the Corps of Discovery worked constantly to stay warm and find food. Hunting brought little success, but nearby Mandan villagers traded corn and other provisions, helping the weary explorers endure the bitter season. The Mandan also shared their knowledge and traditions. They taught the men how to make blue glass beads known as chief's beads. In the northwest, these beads were used as currency and as ornaments worn in the hair or around the neck. Among Sacagawea's few personal possessions was a belt of blue beads, her most treasured belonging. As spring approached, Lewis and Clark prepared to continue their journey. Early in April, they sent a barge and several men back down the Missouri River with reports and specimens for President Jefferson. The cargo included a live prairie dog, 4 magpies, several new plant samples, and a finely made native robe. Those who remained at the fort built new boats and gathered supplies for the long journey ahead. On April 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery set out once more. This time, Sacagawea, her husband Toussaint Charbonneau, and their infant son, Pomp, were part of the expedition. They travelled westward up the Missouri River in 6 canoes and 2 long pirogues. For most of the men, the voyage meant leaving home behind. For Sacagawea, it was the opposite. She was returning toward the homeland she had not seen in 5 years. As the current carried them deeper into the unknown, she must have wondered whether her family still lived and what they would think of her child. Sometimes she rowed in the boats. Other times she walked along the riverbanks beside Captain Clark. Pomp rested in a cradleboard strapped to her back. At night, she and her family shared a tent with the two captains and Clark's servant York. Clark, who came from a large and affectionate family, grew close to Sacagawea and her son. He soon realized that having her with them was one of the best decisions they had made. Only days after leaving Fort Mandan, Sacagawea found wild artichokes growing along the shore and cooked them for the men's supper. Her knowledge of native plants would soon prove vital to the expedition. On May 14, 1805, her courage saved the journey itself. That morning was thick with fog. Lewis and Clark were walking along the bank while Sacagawea, with Pomp on her back, rowed in one of the pirogues. Her husband was steering when a sudden gust of wind struck the sail. The boat tilted sharply and began to take on water. Charbonneau panicked, for he could not swim. As the others struggled to steady the vessel, supplies began slipping into the river. Amid the chaos, Sacagawea acted quickly. She leaned over the side, rescuing journals, instruments, medicines, and other vital cargo. Clark later wrote that nearly every important item had been saved by her hands. Had those supplies been lost, the mission might have ended there. To honour her bravery, the captains named a nearby creek Bird Woman's River. Today, it is known as the Sacagawea River. As the expedition pressed westward, the Missouri River grew faster and clearer. Cottonwood trees lined its banks, and pine and juniper covered the rising uplands. The higher ground also brought colder weather. Even in late May, thin sheets of ice formed on the water in their kettles each morning. Rain and snow slowed their progress, but deer and buffalo remained plentiful. The hardships never stopped. Men waded through freezing water to pull the boats forward, their feet raw and bleeding. Mosquitoes attacked in thick clouds. Rattlesnakes struck from the grass. Illness spread among the men, bringing fever and exhaustion. In early June, Sacagawea became seriously ill. Her fever worsened each day, and Lewis and Clark feared for her life. Without her, they could not hope to communicate with the Shoshone or obtain the horses needed to cross the Bitterroot Mountains. Clark's journal from June 16th reads, "The Indian woman very bad, out of her senses. The captains took turns caring for her. They brewed tea from tree bark and gave her water from an iron-rich spring nearby. Slowly she began to recover and regained her strength by June 24th. By then, the expedition had reached the Great Falls of the Missouri River, where the water plunges more than 400 feet. The sight was magnificent but also daunting. They could not travel through the falls, so they were forced to haul their boats and supplies around them. The task, known as portaging, tested every ounce of their endurance. They carved rollers from tree trunks and pushed the heavy canoes over rocky ground. Cactus thorns tore through their moccasins and grizzly bears prowled near the camp at night. Lewis's dog, Seaman, barked through the darkness to keep the animals away. Then the storms arrived. On June 29th, a powerful thunderstorm swept across the plains. Sacagawea, carrying Pomp, took shelter beneath a rock ledge with Clark and Charbonneau. Within moments, the rain turned into a flood. The water rose quickly through the ravine. Clark pushed Sacagawea and her child up the slope as Charbonneau pulled them to safety. They escaped just before the flood waters surged more than 15 feet high. Pomp's cradleboard was swept away, but Sacagawea never let go of her son. At the main camp, hailstones the size of a man's fist battered the men. One was knocked down several times. Lewis later wrote that the hail measured nearly 7 inches across and bounced high after hitting the ground. By July 1st, the portage was finished, and the falls were behind them. The men built 2 new canoes from cottonwood logs and continued their climb along the Missouri River. By late July, the landscape began to look familiar to Sacagawea. Her pace quickened. After years of captivity, she was nearing her homeland. On July 22nd, they reached a stream she recognized. Nearby stood the place where she had been taken from her people 5 years earlier. Days passed with no sign of the Shoshone. The captains grew worried. They needed horses and guides to cross the mountains, but their food was nearly gone and their strength was fading. Despite the hardships of the journey, Sacagawea never lost hope. When the expedition reached a rocky landmark called Beaver's Head, she felt certain that her own people, the Shoshone, were close. On August 1st, the captains decided to divide their forces. Lewis took a small group overland to search for the Shoshone, while Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and their baby Pomp continued upstream with Clark and the others. Days later, on the morning of August 13th, Lewis and 3 of his men spotted 2 Shoshone women and a young girl gathering plants along the riverbank. Startled by the strangers, the women bowed their heads in fear, but Lewis approached with calm and kindness. Speaking softly, he offered them beads and mirrors, then gently painted their cheeks red, which is a traditional sign of peace. Reassured, the women agreed to lead Lewis and his men to their village. They had just begun their journey when the sound of hooves echoed through the valley. 60 Shoshone warriors appeared on horseback, surrounding the small group. The tension eased quickly when the chief dismounted and greeted Lewis with an embrace. He then led the explorers to his camp, where they shared a ceremonial pipe in friendship. Lewis explained that another group of his men was nearby, and that a Shoshone woman was travelling with them. He invited the chief to meet this second party. The chief agreed, though some of his warriors feared it might be a trap. Meanwhile, Captain William Clark and the rest of the expedition were advancing from another direction. As Sacagawea walked along the riverbank, she spotted several riders in the distance. For a moment she stood still, then began to dance and gesture with joy. Touching her fingers to her mouth, she gave the Shoshone sign, meaning, "These are my people." The warriors were astonished and overjoyed to see her. Their fears vanished, and they greeted the explorers warmly. Together, they rode toward the Shoshone village. As they neared the settlement, a young woman rushed through the crowd and embraced Sacagawea. The two spoke quickly, laughing and crying at once. It was Sacagawea's childhood friend, the same girl who had escaped captivity during the military raid years earlier. After 5 long years apart, they were together again. Inside the village, Lewis and Clark met with the Shoshone chief while Sacagawea translated. As she looked at the man before her, she suddenly recognized him. Her eyes filled with tears. Rising, she crossed the room and placed her blanket over his shoulders, a sign of deep affection and kinship. The chief was her brother, Kamiawait. The reunion was filled with emotion. Sacagawea wept openly, while Kamiawait remained calm but deeply moved. After speaking privately with him, she composed herself and returned to her role as interpreter. Through a long chain of translation, from English to French, to Minatari, and finally to Shoshone, Sacagawea explained that the captains needed horses to continue west. The process was slow, but an agreement was reached. The explorers would trade weapons, tools, and clothing for horses and guides. With that exchange, the Corps of Discovery gained what they needed to cross the Bitterroot Mountains and continue toward the Pacific. The expedition stayed among the Shoshone for several days. During that time, Sacagawea learned that most of her family was gone. Only her brothers, Kamiawait and another sibling, and a young nephew had survived. The news must have filled her with both sorrow and strength. She could have stayed with her people, safe among the mountains of her childhood. Instead, she chose to continue the journey. Perhaps it was loyalty to Lewis and Clark, who had treated her with kindness and respect. Perhaps it was a sense of purpose, or the dream of seeing the great ocean she had heard about as a child. Soon she overheard troubling news. Kamiawait, facing hunger among his people, planned to keep the horses and lead his tribe east to hunt buffalo. Concerned, Sacagawea told Charbonneau what she had learned and asked him to inform Captain Lewis. Lewis confronted the chief at once, reminding him of his promise. Ashamed but understanding, Kamiawait honoured his word and released the horses. Once again, Sacagawea's quiet courage had preserved the expedition. Without her, the Corps of Discovery might never have crossed the mountains or completed their mission. In late August, during the season the Shoshone called the moon, when the geese shed their feathers, Sacagawea said goodbye to her brother and the few remaining members of her family. Then, with the Corps of Discovery, she turned her gaze westward once more toward the unknown. Ahead loomed the Bitterroot Mountains, a rugged and merciless stretch of wilderness standing between them and the Pacific Ocean, the final goal of their long and daring mission. The crossing proved to be one of the most punishing parts of the expedition. Early snow buried the narrow trails, turning the steep uplands into slick walls of ice. Horses slipped and tumbled, food supplies dwindled, and hunger became their constant companion. In those desperate days, Captain Clark named a nearby stream Hungry Creek, a name that captured the misery they all endured. Sacagawea, still nursing her infant son, suffered deeply from the cold and lack of nourishment. The men were scarcely better off. Many were weak, sick, and barely able to stand. In desperation, they slaughtered several of their horses for food, a grim but necessary act for survival. By late September, after weeks of exhaustion and cold, the expedition finally descended from the mountains onto open prairie. There, they met members of the Nez Perce Nation. The Nez Perce welcomed them and offered food to the starving travellers. The men feasted on berries, dried salmon, and bread made from camas roots. Some ate too quickly and fell ill. Clark recorded in his journal, "I am very sick today and vomit, which relieves me." Now beyond the mountains, the Corps no longer needed their horses. The Nez Perce agreed to care for the animals until their return. Near what is now Orofino, Idaho, the explorers built 5 new canoes from hollowed logs. In early October, they pushed off once again, paddling west toward the Pacific Ocean. Hunger, however, followed them. Their supplies ran low once more, and they resorted to purchasing 24 dogs from local tribes to eat. As they continued through what is now eastern Washington, they reached the wide and powerful Columbia River. Along its banks they encountered many indigenous communities. Ordinarily, the sudden arrival of an armed group might have caused alarm, but when the tribe saw Sacagawea and her baby, they understood that these strangers came in peace. Clark noted, "No woman ever accompanied a war party. Her presence spoke more clearly than any words." As the party drew closer to the Pacific, the weather turned relentless. Rain fell day after day, drenching the men and their equipment. The Columbia River grew rough and violent. Waves rose high, tossing the canoes in dangerous swells. Logs swept downstream by the current crashed against the shore. The men grew seasick, exhausted and cold. Their clothing rotted, their supplies were soaked, and then came a new torment. Fleas infested their camp and their garments so badly that some stripped off what remained of their clothes and paddled without them, seeking relief wherever they could find it. At last, after months of struggle, they began to smell salt in the air. The ocean was near. On November 7th, 1805, after travelling more than 2,200 miles, the Corps of Discovery reached the Pacific Ocean. Sacagawea, carrying her infant son, had completed a journey across a continent. The explorers camped along the north shore of the Columbia River for nearly a month, searching for a suitable place to spend the winter. But the rain never stopped. The wood was soaked, fires were difficult to light, and warmth was hard to come by. Sacagawea and her child shivered through the endless damp nights. One evening, a Chinook chief visited the camp wearing a striking cape made from sea otter skins. Captain Lewis admired it and wished to trade, but the party had already spent nearly all of their blue beads, which were the most valuable items for trade. Lewis offered 2 blankets instead, but the chief refused, saying he would not exchange his coat for 5 such blankets. Then his eyes caught the glint of Sacagawea's blue-beaded belt, her most treasured possession. He wanted it as much as Lewis desired the cape. In the end, Birdwoman was asked to give up her belt so that Lewis could obtain the garment. In return, she received a blue cloth coat, but her cherished beads, the symbol of her identity and memories, were gone. By late November, the Corps needed to decide where to build their winter quarters. The captains agreed that every member would have a voice in the decision. It was a rare moment of equality in early American history. Among those who voted were Sacagawea and Clark's enslaved servant York. For one of the few times in the young nation's history, both a woman and a man living in enslavement were given the same vote as the officers and soldiers beside them. Sacagawea voted to move south of the Columbia River, where she knew a root called Wapato grew in abundance. Clark recorded her choice in his journal, writing, "Janie in favour of a place where there is plenty of Wapato." Most of the men agreed, favouring the southern shore where elk were also plentiful. Crossing the Columbia into what is now Oregon, the explorers began building their winter home near present-day Astoria. They named it Fort Clatsop, after the local Clatsop people. By December of 1805, the weary members of the Corps of Discovery had finished building their fort on the misty Pacific coast. 6 small rooms stood within its wooden walls, each warmed by its own fireplace. The fort's location was chosen carefully, high enough to avoid flooding and surrounded by forests that offered both timber and game. Elk provided meat for their tables and hides for clothing and blankets, sustaining them through the damp, relentless winter. Though tired, hungry, and far from home, they had reached the western edge of the continent they had set out to find. As the cold months dragged on at Fort Clatsop, the men began preparing for their journey back east, mending gear and crafting over 300 pairs of moccasins, knowing that in the wet and muddy wilderness, even sturdy footwear would last only a few days. They traded regularly with the Clatsop people, exchanging goods for food, especially dried berries pressed into cakes. Along the shore, they discovered something essential for their survival on the journey home: salt. It was needed to season their meals and to preserve meat for the months ahead. To make it, the men filled large kettles with seawater and boiled it over open fires until it evaporated, leaving a crust of salt along the rims. They scraped it carefully into small bags and stored it for the trip. It was a simple process, but the result would prove vital to their success. Around New Year's Day of 1806, word reached the captains that a whale had washed ashore to the south. Captain Clark quickly organised a small group to collect oil and blubber from the carcass. After weeks of eating little more than elk meat and wapato roots, the oily flesh, which tasted like pork fat, was a welcome change. At first, Sacagawea was not invited to go. For her, it was a painful disappointment. She had crossed a continent through hunger, storms, and danger. She had found food when none could be found, saved the expedition's records, and guided the men through lands unknown to them, all while caring for her infant son. Yet now she was being left behind. Through interpreters, she spoke to Captain Clark. "I have travelled a long way to see the great waters," she said. "Now that you are going to see the monstrous fish, I think it very hard that I cannot go." Clark understood and agreed to take her with the party. Together they journeyed to the coast, where Sacagawea stood before the vast ocean and the enormous whale that had washed ashore. It was a moment of awe and wonder at the end of an extraordinary expedition. Weeks passed quietly at Fort Clatsop. On February 11, 1806, Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, whom Clark affectionately called Pomp, celebrated his first birthday. By then, he had begun to walk and say a few words. Clark often referred to him as "my little dancing boy," and at night he would hold the child and hum softly until he fell asleep. When spring arrived, a sense of renewal spread through the camp. The explorers had endured more than 3 months of rain, cold, and illness along the Oregon coast. Now it was time to return home. On March 22, 1806, Lewis and Clark presented Fort Clatsop to the Clatsop chief as a gesture of gratitude for the kindness and hospitality his people had shown. The next afternoon, the corps loaded their canoes, said their farewells, and pushed away from the shore, beginning the long voyage home after nearly 2 years of hardship and discovery. Though the route back was less punishing than their journey west, it still tested their endurance. Hunger and illness lingered, and once again Sacagawea's deep knowledge of the wilderness became essential. She gathered wild onions, roots, and edible plants to sustain the weary men, among them the camas root, whose bright blue blossoms covered the meadows like shimmering water. She also searched for medicinal herbs to help the sick. On May 16, 1806, Captain Lewis recorded in his journal, "Our sick men are much better today. Sacagawea gathered a quantity of the roots of a species of fennel, which we found very agreeable. Her understanding of healing and her connection to the natural world helped sustain the men through the most difficult days." By mid-May, during the season the Nez Perce called the moon. When the ponies shed, the expedition returned to the Nez Perce villages. There, they recovered the horses they had left in the tribe's care months earlier, preparing once again to cross the mountains. Around that time, Sacagawea's infant son, Pomp, became seriously ill. Now 15 months old, he suffered from a high fever and swelling in his neck and throat. Sacagawea and the captains treated him with medicinal herbs and constant care, praying for his recovery. Within days, the fever broke, and the child survived. The expedition pressed on. Later that summer, the two captains divided the corps to explore separate routes eastward. Sacagawea travelled with Captain Clark, guiding him through familiar lands. Though she did not see her people again, she recognized rivers, passes, and trails from her youth, and showed Clark safe passages through the terrain. He later wrote, "The Indian woman has been of great service to me as a pilot through this country." On July 25, 1806, Clark's group discovered a great sandstone pillar rising 200 feet above the surrounding plains near what is now Billings, Montana. Clark named it Pompey's Tower, in honor of Sacagawea's son, the little dancing boy he had grown so fond of. Climbing to the top, he carved his name and the date into the stone. The landmark still stands today, known as Pompey's Pillar, with a nearby stream that shares its name. Weeks later, on August 12th, Lewis's party reunited with Clark's near the border of present-day Montana and North Dakota. From there, the corps followed the Missouri River downstream, retracing the long path toward home. Before leaving the Mandan villages, the captains paid Toussaint Charbonneau $500.33, the equivalent of 2 years' wages. It was a modest reward for 2 years of labour under extreme hardship. Then came the farewells. Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and their young son said goodbye to the captains and the men who had become their family. The Corps of Discovery continued down the Missouri River towards St. Louis. They had travelled more than 8,000 miles and had been gone for 28 months. So much time had passed that many believed they were lost or dead. In late September of 1806, the explorers' canoes finally glided into the harbour at St. Louis. The city erupted in celebration. Crowds lined the shore, cheering the men who had crossed a continent and returned alive. Lewis and Clark were hailed as heroes. Their journey had mapped the vast expanse of the American West and opened a new chapter in the nation's history. For Sacagawea and her child, the long and perilous expedition had finally come to an end. But her story did not fade with the journey's close. The young Shoshone woman who had served as interpreter, guide, and mother had completed one of the most remarkable adventures in American history. Over the course of more than 4,500 miles, she crossed rivers, forests, and mountains with her infant son strapped to her back, facing every hardship with quiet strength, though she was never compensated for her service. After the expedition ended, Sacagawea, her husband Toussaint Charbonneau, and their son Pomp stayed for a time among the Mandan villages. There, Charbonneau received a letter from Captain William Clark. Clark had not forgotten them, especially the little boy he fondly called "my boy Pomp." Clark had settled in St. Louis and wanted Charbonneau to move his family there. He offered to help them in any way he could. If Charbonneau wished for farmland near the city or wanted to start a small business, Clark promised his support. But beneath those practical offers was a deeper desire. Clark hoped to raise young Pomp as his own. In his letter he wrote, "As to your little son, my boy Pomp, you well know my fondness for him. I once more tell you that if you will bring your son to me, I will educate him and treat him as my own child." In time, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Pomp travelled to St. Louis. In the autumn of 1810, Charbonneau purchased a small farm from Clark. For several months the family lived there peacefully. But by the following spring, Charbonneau's restless nature returned. He decided to join a fur trading expedition up the Missouri River, and Sacagawea went with him. Their 6-year-old son remained behind in St. Louis, cared for by William and Julia Clark. By late 1812, Sacagawea and Charbonneau were living at a trading post in what is now South Dakota. There, tragedy struck. On December 20th, 1812, Sacagawea died shortly after giving birth to a daughter named Lisette. She was only about 25 years old. A clerk at the fort recorded her death, writing, "This evening the wife of Charbonneau, a snake woman, died of a putrid fever. She was a good and the best woman in the fort, aged about 25 years. She left a fine infant girl." True to his word, William Clark took in both of Sacagawea's children. He raised them as his own. Pomp grew into a skilled guide and trader, travelling widely across the western frontier. In time, he became the mayor of a small Spanish town in California. The fate of Lisette, his younger sister, remains unknown. Though Sacagawea's life was short, her legacy has endured far beyond her years. The young Shoshone woman who once walked beside the Corps of Discovery became a lasting symbol of quiet strength, endurance, and courage, remembered as a mother, a guide, and a bridge between two worlds. Yet for nearly a century after the expedition, her name faded into obscurity. Throughout the 1800s, as conflict grew between native peoples and white settlers, few Americans chose to honour a native woman's contributions. Her story, like those of many others who shaped the nation's beginnings, was set aside and nearly forgotten until history found her again. By the turn of the 20th century, the wars had ended, and the nation was preparing to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was then that Americans rediscovered Bird Woman. Practically overnight, Sacagawea became a national figure, celebrated as a symbol of courage and endurance. No other American woman has had as many landmarks named in her honour. Across the West, mountains in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Wyoming bear her name. In Washington and North Dakota, lakes are dedicated to her memory. Artists and writers soon followed, inspired by her story. Because her true likeness was never recorded, every image of her has been shaped by imagination. A statue of Sacagawea stands at the state capitol in Bismarck, North Dakota. Another, depicting her with her son, Pomp, was later placed in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. As the 21st century approached, the United States Mint announced plans for a new $1 coin. Sacagawea would appear on its front, carrying her child as she once did on her journey across the continent. 23 artists submitted designs for the golden dollar, and the final options were displayed online. More than 120,000 Americans, many of them schoolchildren, cast their votes for the winning design. In the year 2000, the golden Sacagawea dollar was released into circulation. Its image of a young native woman carrying her baby captured the spirit of exploration, resilience, and motherhood. The coin's release helped spark a renewed wave of recognition, leading to a nationwide commemoration of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial from 2004 through 2006. Across the country, Americans honored the explorers who opened the path to the Pacific, but above all they remembered the young Shoshone woman who had made that journey possible. Her name was Sacagawea, and her legacy endures as a symbol of quiet strength and timeless courage.